All right, thank you guys again for joining me, and welcome, Amanda. Um, this is our week 3 class, so things are winding down. I know everybody's getting pretty eager for the holiday break, so you get about 2 weeks off coming up. And the class is moving along. As far as announcements, I started working on the week 3 exploration. I'm probably about 2/3 of the way through the grades on that. So if you haven't seen that yet, you will probably finish those up tonight. And I am a little behind where I would like to be as far as the Photoshop project grades, but I'm hoping to get those knocked out tomorrow and then get the week 2 projects taken care of. So I really want to have the feedback to you going into the weekend, especially on those projects. I did have a question of whether or not there were examples of some of the design projects for the week 4 projects, and there are. I went ahead and posted a link in the assignment. So when you take a look at the instructions, you'll see the link provided towards the end of the description, and it will show I think I included 6 different designs from past classes. These were ones that I considered to be highly successful. And one thing that I would want to emphasize, though, regarding those projects is that, again, these are highly successful. Some of these students had some proficiency with Photoshop, so so some of them might be a little intimidating, and I don't want that to be the case, because I know that most of the class probably is completely new to Photoshop and do not come from a design background. So this is all very new to you, most likely. So I'm not expecting a level of graphic design skill or artistry with these projects. Just looking to you to make an effort to apply the skills that you've gained through the Photoshop practices, as well as apply the design concepts, the ideas of digital storytelling or visual storytelling, color theory, some color psychology, and visual hierarchy, and the choice of typefaces. And so that's what this has all been leading up to. The mood board is planning those factors, and now you put it into practice. So now all these factors that you've come up with on your mood board, you'll put into that final design. Of course, there's one more step in the mood board, and that is choosing your typefaces. But I'm just looking a little bit ahead, since I did get that question earlier. Are there any questions from you guys? Anything that I can address real quickly? All right, and again, if any questions come to mind as we go along, be sure to let me know. And if you do have any bigger questions, you can email me or catch me at the end of class, and we can hang out and discuss if needed. Okay, so we're continuing looking at the various elements that go into a visual design that influence the visual impression and overall style of that particular design. And this week we're looking at 2 factors. They are typefaces, that is the style of the type and the print, as well as visual hierarchy. And these are 2 related but very different topics. As you saw in your exploration activity, the typeface used and the way it is used can make a big influence on the visual design, the overall feel of that design and the emotion that it conveys. We probably saw that with the movie posters as well, and movie posters would have worked pretty well for that assignment as well. The book covers was actually a suggestion by one of my past students, and I thought it worked pretty well since book jackets are pretty heavily dependent upon the text, more so than other media formats. Just like color, just like logo designs, typefaces are an integral part to a brand's personality, the brand's identity, and become a recognizable aspect of their public image. I've shown you this image before. This is Burger King, and they use that very blocky serif typeface that is pretty iconic of their brand. It's all over the place. It's on their packaging. It's on their signage, which is what this shows. If you went to the restaurants, you'd see signs like this, and it's on their website. So it's across the board. All the media, they use that consistent typeface, and it keeps a consistent personality and a persona for that brand. This is pretty universal. I mean, I've shown you pieces of the Full Sail Style Guide, and if you were to look at our branded publications and websites, you'd see the same thing. It's all very consistent. So as you are developing your mood board, in a sense, you're developing your personal brand, although you're not really setting it in stone, but you do want to represent your personality. And so, so that's something that you want to take into account as you select the typefaces that you will be using. For our purposes, we're going to be focusing on two different typefaces, and you would have done some reading on how to pair typefaces together so that they complement one another, and that's complement with an I, not like complementary colors. So they look good together, basically. The two typefaces you'll pick are those used for headings or the big titles, and then that used for body text. And these have different requirements or different needs in terms of the style and the readability and so forth. Let me go back. This is an example from a publication, and this is more straightforward titles. This is actually from the website or the course catalog. Titles are easily recognizable. They stand out so that a reader can easily find the information they're looking for. And the body text is clearly written and very orderly in large blocks of text. If you're working with a visual design, you also have to think about that sort of consideration, but there's usually less text involved. The most important thing, and we'll talk about body text first, since for your design project, you probably won't be using a whole lot of body type. You're not going to have a long passage of text since we're not building a website or a document of any kind. But still, the factor that you want to keep in mind is readability. You want it to be easily read by your audience because it is conveying your message, and you don't want your message to be lost. So with that in mind, it is always best to stick to pretty classic fonts. Things like Arial, Helvetica, Times New Roman, the things that we're all pretty familiar with, because those have been developed specifically for readability and for large passages of text. more decorative fonts, while they have a more distinctive style, become difficult to read with the more text there is. So these script fonts, like you see at the bottom here, they can be very pretty, but if you have a lot to read, it can be a strain on your reader's eyes, and you don't want that to happen. Also, typefaces with special effects, styles, like the 3D effect here, really avoid that for your body type. These classic sans serif and serif typefaces are the way to go. Sans serif, and that should have an S on the end of it. Sans just means it's without the little extensions, the little points on the corners of the letters. Those are serifs, and those with serifs are the serif typefaces. Both of these there's some debate about which is preferable as far as readability, but there's really no conclusive decision on that. So ultimately what it comes down to is, what kind of style do you want to go for? Sans serif tends to be seen as more modern and more clean and yeah, just sort of matching the more modern style, whereas those with serif are more classic, sometimes seen as more old-fashioned or historical because they do look like the old newspaper print. And so if you want a more formal and more reserved look, then sometimes a serif typeface is the way to go. Something that's more artsy, more modern and clean can go with a sans serif. So it's just sort of the visual impression that you want to go for. But in all cases, sticking to these really classic system fonts is the best for sake of readability. So these are the ones that you would want to really focus on. And also because these are usually on everybody's computer. So if you hand off a document to somebody and you've used one of these typefaces, you're pretty safe in knowing that it's going to show up the same way you designed it. But if you used a very obscure typeface that you pulled down off of dafont.com and put that in, say, your mood board document and gave it to me, it's not going to show up unless I have that installed on my computer, because it is looking for that in order to display it. And if it doesn't find it on my machine, it's not going to show up and it'll default to something different. So using these very common, they're called system fonts, helps prevent that. And if you're working on a website, that's essential. You have to stick with those font families unless you go through the trouble of embedding the fonts, which is another step altogether. It's just not going to display properly. So sticking with this list is the best approach with your body text. Since we're sharing the document, by the way, this as a side note, since you are sharing your mood board document with me, if you do choose typefaces that are out of the ordinary, I ask that you do a screen capture and embed those typefaces as a graphic, which typically you would not want to do, but since we're sharing a document and I want to make sure that I see your choices as you chose them, that's the way to go about that. And if you're sharing a PDF, then it's all pretty much set in stone and it will show up exactly the way you want it. Header text is a little different as far as requirements. You get a little bit more flexibility here, a little bit more room to show an individualized style. And these are the big, bold headings for different sections. The only real rule to choosing a header text is that it needs to contrast in some way with your body type. or body text so that it stands out. You, especially if you're writing for the web, you want your readers to be able to skim the content and find the information that they're looking for so they can tell exactly where that content is based on the headings. And making those headings stand out really accommodates that. So the basic rule of thumb that is in the readings for this week is that if you use a serif typeface for your body text, then use a sans serif for the headings, because it's going to stand out. It's going to look different. And then the opposite is true. If you're using sans serif for your body text, then use a serif typeface for the headers. It takes a little bit of experimentation to find typefaces that work well together, because not all of them do. If we go back here, you can see that there's a pretty wide range of styles even in these basic typefaces, and pairing something like Futura with Rockwell, for instance, just would clash because Futura is very futuristic. That was the intent, whereas Rockwell is very classic and kind of is based on Norman Rockwell, the paintings that are very old-fashioned and kind of Americana style, and it would clash thematically. So you don't want to find yourself doing that. So, pairing these up and taking a look at how they work together, think about the history and the styles, and you'll be able to come up with a pairing that works well together. It gets really tricky if you start using some really stylized typefaces. But again, pulling out a blank Word document and just seeing how they look and seeing how it feels when paired together is the way to go. The reason you don't want to use two sans serif or two serif typefaces together is because it will sometimes look like an error, like you just accidentally left something unformatted, and so it can give the wrong impression. In some instances, you have typefaces that have a different version or a different style that is intended for headings, and this is Helvetica New. And so you have Helvetica New Black, which is large and bold for headings, and that will give a really nice consistent look, and that would work well as for headings and body text pairing that still stands out. It still has a good distinction. You have some room, as I said, to be a little more creative with the styles. So if you have a particular theme that you're going for, like this is more of a 60s kind of hippie style, that I don't know if you're familiar with the Mellow Mushroom pizza places that are here in town in Orlando, and I know in a few other towns, but they go for that as part of their brand. And so something like this would be appropriate. If you are working with electronic gaming, then some of these pixelated looking typefaces would work. Or stick with the classics if you want something that's more reserved or conservative or more businesslike. That is an option. Again, if you're sharing the document, then the typefaces should either be share a PDF or use a graphic, or just stick with common system fonts for the sake of consistent formatting. The thing to avoid would be really stylized typefaces that are hard to read, because you still want to communicate your message. And I should say a lot of the factors I'm talking about right now are specifically about documents or website content, and it's still a factor for the type of designs we're doing. Advertisement designs or poster designs, there's going to be less text involved, and so you still want to consider how well they look together. And that's true even if you're doing a logo design that has text, but the amount of reading will be much, much less. sometimes these are called, the heading text can be called display text. This is usually for really unique and highly stylized text. A lot of these are pretty iconic. You can think of some of these brands like Disney and Coca-Cola that even if this didn't say Coca-Cola, if you saw that typeface, you would know who that was because it is that universal and that recognizable. Anybody think of any others that would fit on this list? And so if you are developing your brand and you have a specific typeface that you think you want to associate as a fundamental part of your brand, then you can pick something or design your own. A lot of these were custom made for this purpose. But unless you have a really specific purpose or intent, then sticking with some of the pre-existing typefaces is perfectly fine. Are there any questions so far? I'm just driving right ahead, but please feel free to jump in. So in your mood board this week, you're going to be adding this to these factors to your mood board. You're going to be picking a heading, a header type, and a body type for your design. And so looking at a visual design, and I'm going to go way back to this, this would be equivalent to this title text and the small print. For the most part, you're going to be sticking to a title and a slogan, perhaps. So very limited, but your title would be your heading text and your slogan would be the body type. Okay. This is something that isn't in the reading this week, but I do want to cover very briefly, and that's do's and don'ts of using text. These are some simple rules and things to look out for, and if you keep these in mind, your instructors will thank you. This is probably the most common error I see, and that is choosing form over function. So choosing a visual style over practicality. The example here is a menu design. This is something that was online. But just comparing these two, notice how difficult it is to read the example on the right. It has a very distinctive typeface, but it defeats the purpose. It's not achieving the goal of a menu, which is to communicate the menu options. The one on the left makes use of that unique style for the headings, but still keeps the body type in a readable format. So always err on the side of usability and practicality. Your readers will curse you if you hand them something with that kind of type in it. Second most common issue is too many typefaces. If you, for the most part, you would stick to one or two typefaces. Usually pairing two together gives a nice diversity, but keeps a consistent theme. Unless you're making some kind of artistic statement by using a lot of different typefaces, avoid that altogether. Just stick to one or two. Keep it very clean, very presentable, and straightforward. This also applies to color, and I may have commented on some of the previous Photoshop practices too. Too many colors can also look very cluttered and very distracting, so stick to one or two colors for your typography as well. And on the subject of color, make sure that your text color has good contrast with the background. And that means strong contrast, like very light text over a dark background, or preferably dark text over a light background. If it's too low of contrast, then it just doesn't show up as well. And then sometimes the contrast is too stark or too harsh, and as the case here, and that can be an eye strain as well. So really be kind to your readers, especially if you have a really busy background image. Then there might be a lot of variance in the color or the brightness. So when you place your text, really take a look at it and make sure it's showing up well. If not all of the letters are easily visible, then try experimenting with some alternate placements, or using some techniques to change the contrast. For example, you might add a box, like a square of a solid color behind the text, or you might use a subtle drop shadow. I hesitate to suggest a drop shadow because they can be overused, but it is an option as well. This is a tricky one, and I want you to take a look at this and let me know your thoughts on this. How do you read this message? And what is it trying to say? Right, LaShaw says she tried to read each side separately. And that's not right at all. But it's the way we intuitively expect to read this, because there's the two images and you have two different colored text associated with each side. So logically, we would think this is one message and this is the other. But the way it's written, it is intended to be read all the way from left to right as a single paragraph. Don't do this. Do not break up your text in this way. If you're going to break up the text in this way, then have it read to the end here and then start up again on the opposite side. Otherwise, this is just very confusing, very inefficient, and will not communicate your message very well at all. We intuitively group things according to these natural divisions between the image or by the color of the text. And so if you're going to use different boxes or different colors, then use that to separate independent messages or independent pieces of text. This was an example from the book cover archive, actually. I don't think anybody has selected this one of the ones I've seen so far, but this one has a little bit of that problem going on. The title of the book is Capture the Flag. The subtitle is The Stars and Stripes in American History, and the author is Arnaldo Testi, but there's not a lot aside from the color differentiation and the size to some extent that differentiates these elements, and the author and the subtitle is exactly the same size and exactly the same color, so there's nothing separating that out. So for sake of intuitiveness, you would want to vary the size of your font, vary the color of your font within limits. You don't want to use too many typefaces. But say if they had reused the blue for the author, then that would separate that from that subtitle. There it is without any color at all. You see it becomes a little more obscured. Similar to that is accommodating how we read. And I'm going to say that probably for everyone in the class, we learn to read left to right, top to bottom, based on our native languages. And so when you design your text, you want to follow that rule, because deviating from that rule will make it counterintuitive. So pretending that these pieces were, say, a magazine title, and the magazine is called Ready for Liftoff, or it could be a book title. How would you read these? And think about how this would intuitively be read. If you have pieces aligned to the right, then usually we expect those to come after, because we start on the left. We're conditioned to read in that way. Similarly, we go from top to bottom. So the most intuitive way to present this would be this last option. And even if you have a design, like a poster design that breaks up pieces of text, your viewer will expect whatever is in the top and to the left to come first, and whatever is lower and to the right to come second. So when you're arranging your text, really keep that in mind. This one, and I don't want to discourage you from experimenting with what Photoshop is capable of, because it does include a lot of 3D transformations and text warping and so forth. And if you can make that work well, I'm not going to tell you at this point to not try that out, because that is part of learning Photoshop. Overall, though, stay away from a lot of special effects, really heavy special effects on your text, things like drop shadows and glows or 3D transforms and so forth, and really heavy distortion. These things can be overused. A lot of times they become a little bit of a cliche, or in worst cases, they can make it difficult to read your text, and you don't want that. That's counter to our goals. So picking a distinctive typeface and presenting it in a clear manner is usually the best way to go. So no. Unless you have a specific reason for doing it, if it's part of your design motif. And this one is one of the book covers. This is done in a very purposeful manner, and this has Superman, and there he is, tiny right there, but he's zooming up, and we kind of can imagine this being the path of his flight, and the text is following that, using that text transformation and warping. So in this case, this is, of course, a graphic designer that was pretty competent with their craft, making very purposeful use of text distortion. So if you have an artistic reason for doing that, go for it. Otherwise, more straightforward text works just fine. Yeah, this is another example of very purposeful use of very limited text transformation. So even just that slight slant helps to go along with the theme of the mountain, climbing the mountain. This wouldn't be too bad, but going more than this can get a little bit burdensome for your readers. So just sort of a rapid fire list of do's and don'ts, mostly don'ts. Any questions on any of that so far? So those factors will play a part in next week's design project once you get into Photoshop, and also your Photoshop practices for this week. Keep those in mind. This will be in the archive if you do need to review those. And our second topic for this week is visual hierarchy. The visual hierarchy really won't play a part in your mood board project, since it is specific for a visual design, but it is something that you want to keep in mind for your design project next week, and also in all of your visual media from here forward in the program. This will be an important factor to consider. Is everyone familiar with the term hierarchy and know what that represents? It is an order or classification of importance, so a ranking essentially. And a pretty common, well-known hierarchy is that of medieval culture in Europe, with the king or the royalty, king and queen on top, and then the nobles and the knights and the peasants at the bottom, kind of the common people. So this is a hierarchy. This is a social hierarchy, ranking of order of importance in a social context. So that is the hierarchy of these individuals. So if you were to take that into a visual context, then a hierarchy becomes the order of importance of the visual elements. And this is a very purposeful arrangement of elements that implies their importance. So you as the designer would have to very purposely create this order of importance or dominance. At the top of your hierarchy would be the most dominant, the most important element of your design. This is the thing that you want your viewers to notice first. It's to grab their attention immediately. And then you go down kind of the list from there into what's called the subdominant elements, those that should be noticed afterwards, that are still relevant to your message, but not the most urgent to be seen. And then after that, you kind of keep going down and down until you get to the little minutiae and the details and the background image and things that really don't matter as far as the message go. They're just there to make a complete picture. If they weren't there, it would look odd, but it really doesn't affect the message itself. This is something that is, again, purposeful. It's very intentional. So you have to decide, okay, what is the most important part of this that that my viewers need to see in order to understand what I'm trying to say to them, and make that stand out. You can make that stand out through the use of a variety of techniques. Color, size, different textures or value, like lightness and darkness, and just any kind of break in a pattern. Looking at this example, what would you say is the very top of that visual hierarchy in this image? And that's just looking at this poster on the right. Amanda says the cup. Why is the cup the dominant element? And the color, yeah. It's the biggest and the only thing that isn't blue. There you go. Right, and look what color it is. It's orange, which we remember is the complementary color to blue. So it has that high contrast. So they made use of the color theory to make that object stand out. So we can assume that this is probably a poster for perhaps a coffee shop or cafe. And also the steam rising out of the cup is making a treble clef. So there's a combination of themes, coffee and music. What would be next? So if we take a step down on the hierarchy, so there's the top, what's the next level of the hierarchy? After the cup, what's the next most important thing? And Regina says the heading or the title. Yeah, and so because of its size is the next in importance. It doesn't have the color contrast, so it doesn't stand out as sharply as that cup, but it's still pretty prominent. Right, and then you just keep going down the list. So then obviously the designer wanted you to notice the musician's name and the date, the location, so the plaza at Bishop's Landing. And then after that, there's all these little minute details, kind of the fine print. But this is done in a very purposeful manner, in a very orderly manner, and they've decided, exactly what experience they want you as the viewer to have. And I've kind of named these off already, but different shapes, different textures, colors. An interesting thing about the human brain is that it looks for patterns, and it's very cued to patterns. So if you break from the pattern, say if you have a series of dots and one of them is suddenly a different color, that's the one that stands out because that's what we look for. So you can make use of that as well, changes in patterns, using color, position, orientation, and so forth. So here's some examples from your explorations. Look at these two examples. One has a pretty distinct visual hierarchy, and the other has a very weak visual hierarchy. And notice the difference that it makes. They both have a visual hierarchy, but the one on the left is barely noticeable, whereas the one on the right has more distinct divisions as far as importance. Here, the words "a novel by" are just very slightly lighter in value than the other words. So it's non-essential compared to the title and the author, but it's not a very strong difference. That doesn't really tell you what's the most important. On the other hand, the hiding man, this is an interesting case because the hiding man is the title of the book, but it's de-emphasized, as well as the author's name is given less emphasis because the publisher decided that the subtitle, A Biography of Donald Bartholomew, was the most important aspect. Perhaps. I don't know who Donald Bartholomew is myself, but anyone who would be interested in this book, that name would be the most important aspect. So it's given that extra emphasis. So these are examples. This is an example of both the benefit that a visual hierarchy offers. It's that experience, that recognizability, and also how these kind of decisions need to be made. That what do you want to emphasize? And then how are you going to emphasize it? Coming up with those decisions is a matter of knowing who your audience is, what's going to matter to them, what's going to be most appealing to them. So, the name of the subject of this biography is the most important. If you just saw Hiding Man, that doesn't tell you anything, but this tells you what this book is about. With that in mind, what do you notice about these two covers as far as where the emphasis is placed? And why do you think it was done in that way? Okay, and the question was, what are the differences in terms of where emphasis is placed between these two book covers? And Lasha says the picture on the right, so that would be the terrorist cover, the emphasis is placed on the author, whereas the one on the left, the emphasis is placed on the title. And yeah, that was really what I was going for, because you can see that there's a difference in what the publisher felt was most important, or what was most attention getting for the potential readers. John Updike being a recognized author, his name will be emphasized over the name of the book. If somebody is a fan of his writing already, that will be more important than seeing the title of the new release. Whereas if it's a lesser known author, sometimes the title can be the attention getter because it presents a subject that might be very compelling. And so that's up to the designer, but and especially the publisher, whoever is the decision maker, to make those calls. Besides the factors that I listed as far as color, size, and so forth, you can also make use of layout to direct attention. The Wall Street book, notice how the shape created by the buildings creates a frame around these key elements, the American flag, Wall Street title, and Steve Frazier, the author's name. These three, kind of a triad of key elements, are each emphasized in very different ways. The American flag is very colorful. It really stands out. It's a pretty iconic image. The author's name is emphasized in red, slightly smaller text than Wall Street. So it's really, in terms of visual hierarchy, pretty close to the same level, but framed within this area, so our attention comes to this central negative space. Also, look at the lines of these buildings. Remember last week we looked at the Vincent van Gogh painting of the cafe scene, and all the lines were coming together to point to a specific place. All the lines in this buildings are coming to this center, directing the eye to that spot. That's a technique called leading lines, by the way. It's you make use of the lines that are already in your images or in your environment to direct attention. You'll see cinematographers use that with hallway scenes where they'll put their subject at the end of the hall, and the converging lines will direct your eye in that direction. This is a very similar technique over here on the right. The words all radiate outward from that little figure, and helps to direct attention. So this little figure that otherwise would be low on the hierarchy becomes a little more noticeable. And and the use of the text size in order to build emphasis on the title. And this use of line is something that's a really useful technique, something to start building an eye for. When you select the images you're going to use, think about how you might make use of the lines that are already there. Some of you already did that in the very first Photoshop practice, where you aligned your text with the lines of some of the architecture in the image, or the railings with the pig races and so forth. So something to continue to refine and develop your eye for. And visual hierarchy is used in every form of visual media. We're focusing on advertising design for this class, but these ideas are universal. So if you're developing a website, and actually you will use visual hierarchy when you get to web design down the road, you'll decide where you want to put emphasis through the sides of your text or the imagery and so forth. You can see that there's a pretty clear hierarchy of elements here, as well as this example where they made more use of color to direct attention. This is that accented achromatic design from last week, and I mentioned that you can use those accent colors to direct the viewer's eye, and that is a technique for visual hierarchy. So in your own designs, you might find it useful to take out the color in the image, but leave a single focal point in color, to give significant meaning and also to direct attention. These are useful techniques. Or even altering the color so that you can use your complementary colors, like with the cup and the perfect blend, to draw attention. So seeing how all those different Photoshop skills are really kind of coming to this point where you can apply those skills to create a very purposeful and intentional experience for your audience. Any questions so far? On any of this content as well as the activities coming up? That was the material I had prepared for tonight. But you can see how the different factors are starting to come together. So you make use of text and color to communicate the message, and using your color and size to develop emphasis, and you can incorporate all of those factors into digital story or visual storytelling in order to communicate that story. And there isn't, Jennifer, your question, is there extra credit in this class? There isn't extra credit in the course for the most part, because the system isn't set up to go over 100 points for the class. However, I do have it set up so that if you make corrections to your mood board from past weeks based on my feedback, you can re-earn any of the points that were deducted, up to 10 points. So that's an option. And if it looks like I've overlooked any of the corrections you've done for your mood board, then make sure to point those out to me, because I don't want to miss it if you have made corrections. But yes, and that only applies to the mood board project, because that's the mood board project is sort of the ongoing developing project that is done in stages, and so it lends itself to that sort of setup. Okay, no problem. Very good. I'll be taking a look at those very soon.